George Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention. He sat on a chair with a picture of the sun half risen or half setting. Benjamin Franklin thought it an apt picture. Is the sun rising on America, or is it setting? Time would tell. Throughout the entire convention, Washington presided, but spoke very little. The man who spoke the most at the convention was Pennsylvania delegate Gouverneur Morris. James Madison of Virginia kept copious notes of the convention, but these were only released upon his death. He is sometimes called the father of the Constitution. He certainly was one of its biggest advocates. He worked tirelessly to champion its cause before, during, and after the convention.
I think that George Washington probably was the most decent American that we've ever had. He was a very successful general, and he was just a decent person. And after the war, they wanted to make him king. And he said, no, we did not fight a war to have a monarchy. James Madison would come in, I think, a clear second as another decent American and the father, essentially the father of the United States Constitution.
James Madison of Virginia was born in 1751. Surprisingly, as a Virginian, he chose to attend Princeton, not William and Mary. After graduating Princeton, Madison stayed on an extra year, studying how to translate the Bible into English and back into Hebrew and Greek.
Mr. Madison was sent to Princeton College, perhaps through fear of the skeptical principles then so prevalent at William and Mary. During his stay at Princeton, a great revival took place, and it was believed that he partook of its spirit. On his return home, he conducted worship in his father's house. He soon after offered for the legislature, and it was objected to him by his opponents that he was better suited to the pulpit than to the legislative hall. Bishop Meade.
But Madison's ministry, if it could be called that, was in the political realm. He lost his first election to a statewide office because his opponent provided little bottles of alcohol for those who would vote for him. But Madison ran again later and won, and he served on a committee in 1776 that framed a Bill of Rights for the state of Virginia. Madison insisted on religious liberty, not mere tolerance, in that document. This was something he had learned well from his main teacher at Princeton, the president of the school, the Reverend Dr. John Witherspoon, a devout Presbyterian who came from Scotland. Some scholars note that Witherspoon is perhaps best known as the Founding Father, who as an educator trained many of the Founding Fathers. Madison returned to Virginia, where he became an attorney. He befriended Thomas Jefferson, a kindred spirit, and worked with him. Together, they worked to safeguard religious freedom. They were heroes to the evangelicals of their day, such as the Baptists, who were punished by the officials in Virginia for preaching without a license they could not obtain because they were Baptists by choice and not members of the Church of England. Madison was a key player at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and a key player also to get it ratified. After the Constitution was written, the founders had to convince the various states to adopt it. New York was reticent, and so under the pseudonym Publius, letters were sent to the editors of newspapers throughout the state. These essays came to be known as the Federalist Papers.
The Federalist Papers were authored by three primary lawyers, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they promoted the ratification of the U.S. Constitution as a Federalist concept. And so what that means is that we understand that the federal government is required for preservation of the Union, but that the founders recognized that state government and state sovereignty was important and had to be close to the people, but also a third tier, that of self-governance. And so when we look at the 9th and 10th Amendments that were ultimately ratified as part of our Bill of Rights, we see that we have specific limited powers given to our federal governments, our state governments, and that any powers not given to those two branches are reserved to we the people.
The founding generation were very distrustful of this new national government that was being created. Let's remember, they had fought a war of independence against a centralized authority operated out of London that wasn't attentive to the needs of the people at the local level. And there were many Americans at the moment of the creation of the new national government that had fears that we would simply see that same problem emerge. There would be a distant, national, centralized government that would run roughshod over the rights and liberties of citizens.
There is scarce a king in 100 who would not, if he could, follow the example of Pharaoh, get first all the people's money, then all their lands, and then make them and their children servants forever. Ben Franklin.
The genius of the founders and what makes America what it is and what it has been by God's grace for 240-something years is their idea that we need checks and balances because the biblical view that man is fallen is inescapable. Somehow you need to have a check on power. How do you do that? Well, they said separation of powers is the main way that we will do that.
Well, the notion of separation of powers again goes back to the Old Testament. As the Jews put it, in the covenant you have 3 crowns: the monarchy, the priesthood, and the prophets. And none of them have final power.
The rights were inherently given to the people by God, and that all the government could do would be to take away the rights of the people.
All men having power ought not to be trusted. James Madison.
The founders thought that mankind was basically sinful, so they had to devise a system to cope with that sinfulness. And one of the ways they did was to keep government limited. They did not trust government, but they know that we needed some government, but we have to keep government as small as possible.
Mankind, when left to themselves, are unfit for their own government. George Washington.
Till the millennium comes, in spite of all our boasted light and purification, hypocrisy and treachery will continue to be the most successful commodities in the political market. Alexander Hamilton.
One of the keys to understanding the Constitution is its emphasis on dividing power so that no one person or group of people could lord the power unto themselves. They had begun the proceedings on May 25th and eventually finished the task and signed the document September 17th. But the Constitution was not signed by every one of the 55 men who served as delegates to the Constitution. Only 39 of them signed it, a ratio of about 60%. Nonetheless, it was produced and signed to the delight of many, including George Washington.
It appears to me then little short of a miracle that the delegates from so many different states, which states you know are also different from each other in their manners, circumstances, and prejudices, should unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections. George Washington.